For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rawlinson. Just keep it at that. So you guys learned a lot about the different capabilities that we can do in terms of the platform, a lot of cloud integration stuff from a technology perspective, which is what to do, when to do it, how to do it. So my goal is to kind of show you how this stuff comes to works and how to consume it in the real world, just aside from the technology. And I'll give you some perspective on how the time comes where these things are kind of necessary, how you can actually use the capabilities of the platform with many tools. I'm actually going to use one tool that I used to leverage quite often in the past, which is VMware-based tools, to kind of demonstrate some of the stuff that I want to drive some of the points that I want to get across. Unfortunately, I had a little mishap, so we're just going to go wild here, see what happens. And I'll do some dancing, but just in case. So just think about this scenario here. Typically, in today's world, we have a lot of demands for dealing with information, data, applications, you name it. It is very, very tough and very challenging to adhere to corporate mandates with regards to keeping data safe, keeping data in the different places where it needs to be. It's tough enough to do that in a single sort of entity, in a single sort of data center. And now today, when you start dealing with multiple data centers, you kind of get to this point where it becomes very, very challenging just to kind of get to that point. Because now, not only do you have to end up with supporting different infrastructures with different requirements, different SLAs, and all these components become critical if something ever goes wrong and you need to have access to this data. So it's no longer just about, I need to protect my data, I need to have data accessible to me, is I need to use my data at any point in time in whichever cloud it fits best, right? We got to the point where, I remember in the early days of cloud, cloud was considered a place. Yeah, it somewhat is a place, but it's more like a consumption model, right? Where one cloud service can give you a better price, better capabilities, better resources, where you can actually take your data, spend it where you need to have it for multiple use cases, whether it be availability, recoverability, or even test and dev, whichever way you want to do it. So now think about when you have something of a mandate that comes from a corporate that says, listen, I need to have, for this type of data, for this type of application, these particular requirements in terms of retention locally, in terms of replication for disaster recovery, in terms of accessibility for long-term retention, or even now, which I honestly can tell you that the new test and dev model where instead of having to procure hardware, put it in a data center, go through that whole nonsense, I can very easily achieve that by pushing it out to one of the public clouds, where the test and dev sort of use case becomes very, very useful in that particular case. Being able to look at some of the information that you have, even whether it's out in the public cloud or even on-prem, becomes even more important nowadays, because now instead of running some of these heavy jobs and functions within a data center, you can actually push them out to a cloud as well, because you have the same data, you have the same access you did before, and you no longer have to bog down your system to do some of the things you need to do in the past. So this becomes very, very, very useful, but the challenge is kind of getting to this, right? There are many steps, many tasks, which actually just basically expose many, many risks when it comes to infrastructure management as you move forward to the cloud too as well, and you bring it back and all those different things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of scenarios here where I'm going to utilize a VMware sort of tool that we've kind of all somewhat familiar with. If I find my stuff here it is. So I'm going to use the cloud platform just to kind of drive that. We're talking cloud, right? So I actually, the idea that I had here was to show you something where tie in all the things that the guys demonstrated for you today. So I even had access to Azure here. That's one of the clouds that I was consuming. So that when you do your support, spin up or your cloud mobility, and it pops up in Azure, you don't have to go to Azure to manage and tear it down. You do it straight from here. Because VRA still has those capabilities where you can tie your account and all those things based on the permissions. They stay and remain right here. So you don't have to leave the control plane to actually manage what you do and still do the tear down and all those different things. So in this scenario, look, what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to present to you the way in which an infrastructure would be consumed, which could be in multiple cases. It could be in the sense of maybe this infrastructure, cloud-based, all of that integrated, could be managed and consumed as more of as an infrastructure from an administrative perspective, not in the typical sense of end user perspective as a tenant, but beyond that, right? Because you can actually deploy infrastructure components that may be providing a service for other tenants, right? So just take that sort of angle approach here. So one of the things that we're able to do, so obviously the guys have shown you how you can actually get to our UI. And for example, you get to see these sort of protection jobs that we have. And I want to show you one that sort of has everything in it, which adheres to the to the example that I presented logically here. So let me just kind of get into this particular job here. And if I get into the actual settings and open up the, it's not even a good one here. Let me just go to this. So some of the things that you can do, right? So think about this. So we can easily achieve all these sort of requirements in a single task, right? One task that carries out not only your local data protection with a particular retention time and period, but you can also add to the same task the other following jobs where you want to do long-term retention, you want to do the data portability across different clouds, all of them in one single task, right? So now you're eliminating not only the risk of infrastructure management across multiple clouds and also on your on-premises environment, and you're not consolidating and making the actual operational efficiencies in this case very efficient and risk adverse. So if you take a look here, this is one particular policy as we kind of set up the components for the protection job. So we have, like I presented, a mandate for local data protection, wherever it is, which starts there. But then you have also the ability to have for replication purposes, for disaster recovery purposes, for high availability, or even instantiating workloads in other clouds. You have availability in Azure, you have availability in AWS, you have availability in GCP, but you have long-term retention. So different applications, different sort of VMs for that particular case can all be protected and can all go through this process, which is probably potentially something that is mandated from corporate, right? You have to start listening to the fact that we have to adhere to compliance in terms of data retention, in terms of different compliance acts that might be available, and you can actually satisfy those in a very simplistic way, right? Here you have one task that actually takes care of 7 different components, of 7 different actions, which are actually taking place across separate networks, separate clouds, right? And also serving the purpose of keeping all your data available to the latest point. So you saw John demonstrated the cloud spin capability. And then we also showed how we actually do the data portability or the application portability across clouds, how we migrate that. These functions actually include those capabilities, right? All unified. Now, if I wanted to be some sort of, we typically have multiple people, multiple staff, different operation procedures to do these kinds of things. So here's the one thing that I find a lot of folks talking about, everyone's always looking for the same kind of thing. We're always in a sort of looking out for this sort of dream single pane of glass. And in reality, every time someone says, here's a single pane of glass, you're just adding to the problem of single pane of glass. But I already have a bunch of single pane of glasses, and you just give me another one, right? So I just add to the problem. In some cases right now, for example, our new single pane of glass, when it comes to looking at Cohesity from a management perspective, we eliminate one particular issue when it comes to looking at multiple clusters, right? So you no longer have to leave this particular UI to jump around different clusters, regardless of where they're sitting, right? AWS, Azure, doesn't matter. But also we unify everything here, right? So that kind of, in a way, gets to that point. But the real power here is that you guys have seen today so far how we can actually leverage all of our APIs to achieve every single function we do here. It's achievable. And the perfect example for that is the fact that in this particular case, that so-called single pane of glass, I'm going to present it here and consume it through a typical service catalog, which this could be today's VMware, it could be tomorrow, something else that you may have, but it doesn't matter. The point is that if I wanted to go and consume this particular workload, you'll notice that one of the things that we're able to do here, and this is all REST API calls that we're making here, notice how here we integrate to the point where we can actually, you don't have to do this, I actually left it in this way so that you can have a lot of options, whether you want to control things in a different cluster where they be. But typically you want to do this in the sort of headquartered and in sort of any way you want to. But by choosing the cluster you're going to go to, which there are many ways to implement this, you can leave it up to dynamically, whether you have a profit center or some sort of business line of service which you can actually charge differently for this kind of stuff, or you can actually add it as a default. But then one of the questions that came up before, which does not really apply to this, but I liked it because I was like, I'm going to drive on that because I'm going to use that. The fact that we can dynamically pull the jobs here directly. So you typically are not going to make it this messy, and this is why my environment just kind of like died this morning. So you see all this deleted stuff. But essentially, you get to the point where this is what's actually what I showed you before. So all these policies, these sort of tasks that you saw being executed individually by one task, you can, at the service catalog level, put it into one function. So and the other thing we're doing here is this. Typically, just imagine what it takes to achieve and implement all those different tasks in different systems, with different staff and different operating procedures. Typically, when you do data protection, data management functions, replication, DR, all these different things, they're day-to operation functions, which in some cases you can actually expose your infrastructure to a risk. Because if someone forgets, or some function fails and it doesn't put that data or that application in the right format, and how they say, stuff hits the fan, and you don't have that, you have a problem. We actually have the ability to put a company out of business if we don't do some of these data compliance facts easier. So when you think about this here, I'm just going to select that and just launch this application. And the point that you'll see here is that I'm just basically, evoking a request to launch a number of applications, which could be 1 to 100, whatever, who cares, right? We know that we could do this, by actually automating that process. Now, what's happening here is this. Typically, with some of these cloud management platform tools that are available, one of the things that we do here is that we mitigate the second-day operation. So that right now, you're basically making a request for an application, whichever way it is, right? We tie into it. Typically, when you're in the enterprise, you get the app owner, the infrastructure owner. So the VM gets deployed. Okay, we're done. Here comes the application owner. Let me touch it. And then at some point in time, here comes the third guy, the second day, say the third team. Now let me put this application, what we have, into some form of the requirements for data management that the company mandated. There's a lot of risk involved there, right? Here, this process, and I hope it finished, what it'll do is that it'll basically eliminate that process. So when the application in the VM is actually done and completed, we are going to automatically put it into the job within our data platform. So the next time the job runs, that application is already there. And it will be part of that standardized sort of procedure so that you don't have to worry about any of this kind of stuff. Now, the functions out of there, whether you want to perform an application mobility function, it's already there. Now, you don't have to put them all in one, but obviously you have to adhere to the requirements that you're being asked about. And the good thing here is that everything that you saw today, so every one of those points where the only one that I can tell you that we cannot yet execute as of yet is the one that Adai did, which I love. That demo is just being able to keep track and kind of move all your data from the S3 buckets, because there was a manual step that he kind of had to do there, but we'll figure that out soon, right? Because we want to put it in a way that we got to make that a process, because that's a real world kind of requirement that we see that happening all the time. So here, while you see this sort of process is going to take some time, and I try to make it really small and stage it, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to the Cohesity job and show you that once you look at the jobs, and I selected some jobs that are running. I think I chose this one here. And I should have showed you the before and after. But basically what you'll see is that the VM that I would deploy will be there, right? So you don't have to touch the system again. So while we're telling you all these things that we can do from here, if your consumption model, if your service catalog is whatever one it is of your choice, in this case it's the one I use from VMware, you kind of eliminate a process there where you can now consume and have the ability to kind of guarantee that your sort of data management functions and the requirements you have from the data perspective are going to be applied and delivered. And you could track all of this all the way down to, if you use, for example, the entire VMware management stack, we integrate with the VROPs, so you can actually see when the job's been completed, you can get alerts on the other side. So all of these things that come about, email alerts, all of those things can actually be done as well, right? Here's the other thing. Typically, we're somewhat new, right? So when we come in, you already have an infrastructure that's been deployed. What happens then? You cannot put something through a catalog like this if you didn't sort of index it and go through the process of making the tools to bring that in. So one of the things that we do very, very nicely from an enterprise perspective, aside from delivering all these features and capabilities, is that we sort of blend in with the rest of your infrastructure. So how would you manage and handle something like this in a way that is not going to be sort of detrimental to your environment? We have all the capabilities that within the same form, yet again, using strictly API calls, I can actually have the ability to any system that was already provisioned and deployed without going through this particular process. We have the ability to basically say, look, there's 100 virtual machines or 1,000 virtual machines that haven't been added to a particular protection job because they weren't running on our stuff yet, right? So as you're transferring and kind of making the change to the newer platform where you're going, you'll have the ability here to simply select the cluster again how you want it. You'll be able to identify the vCenter and the VMs that you want to do. So for example, I want to come in and say, let me go to this data center, I'll look at the VMs, and let me look at for a VM that hasn't been protected per se, and I'll look for something that says, let's see here, this one, and I'll just select. And here again, I come with the job again, right? So you have the ability to do this in bulk, in mass, so you don't have to do it one at a time. But also one of the things that are really good about this is one of the things that we can do is that when we particularly do this particular function here, if you have a tool that allows you to bring in your subscription to any of these public clouds, for example, which mine kind of blew up a little bit. So think about what we just did, what the guy showed you before. You did an application portability from one cloud from on-premise to another. When you do cloud spin, you spin up instances in Azure, which we manage to some degree through some of our UI, some of the things that we can do. Some of them we can't yet, or we don't. But the fact that you have the integration capabilities in a tool like this, whenever you instantiate one of these sort of cloud spin, you can still manage it and still control it from here. So you'll be able to stay within the same context, and we're still within sort of protected. So the same thing applies to if you decided to make this application not just a test and dev, and you want to say, okay, I'm gonna port it as a production workload that I'm gonna keep it in this particular cloud. You now have the same capabilities here that I just demonstrated to protect, replicate, and do everything you want to do natively in the cloud from within the same tools through the same policies. Right? So that basically simplifies a lot of the functions that you would typically go out there and have to deal with when it comes to from an operations perspective. And this is when you'll see how each one of these functions and how this sort of platform kind of becomes more valuable and available, because you can choose either one of those tasks to do the functions that you need to with the same data, right? With the same centralized information that you have, without having to leave things dispersed in different places.
I actually it's a different sort of question in the sense that we are all talking about some organization having a Cohesity environment. Now, I work for a managed public cloud environment company.
Well, you like this then,
Exactly. And
see, there you go.
Coming from a point of view now, from a service provider point of view, that say, if a managed service cloud provider wants to use Cohesity as a feature for their backup stream to provide as a feature to their customers, do you have some sort of a model for them?
Absolutely. It's actually being developed right now. We have a service provider sort of wing of the company that's actually starting to do that. So I can tell you that to obviously achieve what you're asking for, unlike the other tool that I had here, this doesn't have real multi-tenancy, right? So we all know that, right? We don't have to kind of get into that. So our platform is actually from the core, even to the components that are going to come on top. And around the VMware timeframe, you'll see some really awesome stuff that we'll be announcing too, specifically to address some of those things. Catering specifically to the service provider model, with everything from reporting, you name it, isolation, all that kind of stuff that's actually needed for true multi-tenancy in that particular case.
Exactly, because another question that comes to mind when you're trying to do that is because it's one appliance or a bunch of, an infrastructure, but then companies would be concerned about network isolation, for example, or data isolation. Sometimes, in even a VMware environment, they want separate network cards right? So there is this mentality. So how do you address that?
Well, so in our platform right now, at the very core level, we have logical isolation at many layers. So there's the storage domains, there's the logical partitions that you have. Each one of those domains can actually be, you can configure encryption, compression, all those features that we have individually, right? So that's not you applied on the entire cluster. You can logically isolate and provide that sort of segmentation there. With the multi-tenancy stuff that we're also doing, we're going to add even more to that, because that'll be reporting. There'll be all these other components that we didn't have. For example, if you were to look at a cluster today, you will see the entire capacity of for example, of a storage domain that you're consuming. But if you're doing pay-as-you-go, you're going to see this whole bucket of capacity which you're not supposed to use, which is kind of deceiving in a way, right? So those are the things that we're kind of fixing so that you have, the actual capacity you're to consume. We do have quotas and all those kind of things, but it's not, it wasn't the first sort of use case and the intention when this sort of came up. But now with this thing kind of being driven that way, that's what you're going to get.
One other question is to do with where the data is going. So I think in one of the slides there was an RTO of 5 minutes, I think it was. And because the data is going into some sort of blob storage like S3, those kind of things, and which is eventual consistency, right? So again, when the
you want to go there, huh? We have strict consistency. I don't know what those other guys do, but we do strict consistency everywhere.
But by nature for the platform, basically. Now, okay, it's not going to take 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But when we say 5 minutes RTO, then there is data transfer time.
Correct.
Getting written, and then the storage environment acknowledging that it's there now.
Correct.
So all of that. So can you still provide the same RTO?
So in that, it's difficult because, the 5-minute RTO is based on potentially when we will run that function. But the RTO is going to be based on how much data you're transferring based on the changes, right? Keep in mind that we may be able to do that very effectively because in the way in which we transfer data. Before anything leaves the platform, source and destination is dedupe and compress. So once you've done the full sort of ingest and you have one full image, if you're going to do the incremental forever that we do, you're going to do very small changes and track, which is, to be honest with you, some of the stuff we did today, I mean, the VMs that I pumped up to do cloud spin were like 100, 200 gigs. And they just happened while I was trying to fix up my environment to kind of show you that. So once that first initial sort of sync goes on, everything else after that is space efficient, when it comes to the transfer.
Is this based more on anticipated demand from customers, or is this based on actual demand that, as we're doing around the table, they're asking for it right now? Are you just trying to get out ahead of the curve, or are you seeing this from your customers who want to move to the cloud?
This is seen from customers. It's also seen from our product team. Mohit also sees this same way. Notice that our platform is cloud first integrated, right? Our features, we're not just adding on, right? So these are things that are the integration with the public clouds has been from the get-go. A lot of these features, as we've been growing, have been coming on request from some of these really large customers. And we've been going through that process. So everything that we've told you here so far, we're not telling you, we're going to do it because now you said it. They're actually already in the works. And the release that I just showed you there has a lot of those capabilities. Now, there'll be some newer things in a later release where the multi-tenancy stuff, all these things you want to have, and some of the things that Sai said before will be coming live, which we couldn't just turn them around like overnight.
So just to add to that, if you look at that, back to that life cycle that we talked about, or that entire adoption trend, there's a lot of the customers, at least on the cloud side, typically tend to start with the storage IaaS. That's like the birth of where their cloud journey starts. But we are seeing more and more customers. We have a lot of customer wins of late who are adopting our platform in the cloud edition. The native backups is becoming bigger. App mobility is kicking in. So we are heavily customer driven here, and anything that we do is justified by what customers want and the potential revenue behind it. So absolutely, we have customers almost using every single aspect or feature that we touched on today.
So is there a possibility that you may have customers, instead of going cloud spin into like an AMI instance or something like that, just using like a SQL PaaS maybe?
Can you elaborate on that question?
Yeah, so let's say I know that my VM on-prem is a SQL server, right? I'm going to migrate it into AWS or into Azure. Azure. When it gets to the other side, could I maybe in the future be able to select a SQL Server PaaS or managed instance type instead of like a full VM?
I see.
Just a database.
I see.
Yeah.
So today, at least what customers are looking to do is leverage it from the IaaS perspective. But we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Not something I would say we have heard a whole lot of. Because if they're looking to do that, they're thinking about more starting in the cloud and running it from that point. But maybe something that we'll hear more about.
I mean, we do have the ability to protect the database, without having just the VM. We do that today, right?
Your demo was focused on the usage of VRA.
Correct.
To leverage all these workflows.
Correct.
But would it be possible to use any other cloud management?
Absolutely.
More fields, for example?
Yes. This is the only thing, come on, you know where I come from, so that's what I know. Right? So I'm going to use the one I know. But the point is yes, you come, and actually one of the engineers we talked about yesterday, we're going to use some other platform to do that, because all that VRA is doing, we're just making the REST API calls, right? And just the interface is there, we can do that, kind of know how to do that, but they work anywhere.
And to give you, for instance, the ServiceNow integration is
that's
very
another
big
one
for us right now. And again, it's all it is calling the APIs, right?
Yeah.
So for us doing those solutions integrations, it is a lot of times just a matter of here's the API guide.
Done?
All right. So what we'll do then is there is 2 minutes left. And yeah, quick recap, because we already talked about this slide. Again, we're kind of recapping those differentiators, right? It is this concept of the global space efficiency, the hybrid and multi-cloud that we've talked about extensively, that ability to kind of do multi-cloud mobility in particular, policy-driven everywhere. And lastly, that cloud and app integration that we've talked about, whether it's in a virtualized environment or directly into the applications, and of course, built for cloud at its very core.